God is love. Not God loves, but God is love. His essence is love. But the only way you can the only way you can express love is to have something to love, something other than yourself. And God was contained. He didn't need to create. He didn't need to create people. But he did so out of love. He wanted creatures to share in just the joy of existence.
Hello Bible lovers, welcome to Unscrolled. In today's episode we have a very special guest, Philip Yancey, author of 36, I think, books that he has written, 15 million copies published. Somebody who has a lot to say about life, about the Bible, about so many different aspects of society and the intersection of those topics. So we'll dive a little bit deeper on all of those today. I'm very excited about this. So welcome, Philip
Thank you,
Yancey.
Matthias. Good to be here.
Yeah. You were here this morning at an event at the museum. What exactly was that? Maybe you can kind of highlight that a little bit, what you did today.
Yes. I was part of a group who met here for breakfast, actually, and I spoke along with Dr. Francis Collins, who is a great Christian who had been director of the National Institutes of Health. He's an old friend of mine. And then we had a tour. They have an amazing exhibit of the Megiddo,
Yeah.
The Megiddo mosaic that was discovered, possibly the first religious structure that was considered something like a church, a meeting place for Christians back in, was it 230 AD, I think?
Yeah, 1800 years ago, yeah.
Right.
Yeah. Yeah, you have I mentioned you wrote so many books. You have a long history, and if you go through the range of topics that you touch, it's incredibly diverse. And I always wonder, when somebody picks a job. My son is in college right now, and he's trying to figure out what he does with his life. And you were at that stage at some point. You were part of a magazine, I think. And what made you decide to go into writing full time?
I needed a job first. No, I was actually in graduate school, actually, at Wheaton College in Illinois. And I had an undergraduate degree. I didn't know what I wanted to do. And a magazine called Campus Life was located in that same town in Wheaton. And here they have a title, Campus Life, but they have nobody on a campus. And I said, wait, I'm on a campus. I can tell you what campus life is like. So I started writing for young people, teenagers, average age maybe between 16 and 20. And I'm so grateful for that, because it's a hard group to write for. They'd rather be playing video games. Who wants to read a magazine? And so I learned that I, as the writer, am not the boss. I'm not the one in charge. The reader is the boss. And if I have to make it so interesting that they'll read the rest of that sentence and then the next paragraph and turn the page and read the next page. If they don't, I'm out of a job. So that was important. In graduate schools especially, you learn kind of an academic style writing, and you just assume that everybody is interested in what you're saying. But that's not the real world out there. And in the real world, the reader is the boss, and that was an important lesson for me to learn.
I saw that somebody asked you the question if what your favorite book was, and I kind of feel like that's an unfair question to a writer, like asking a parent what's your favorite kid. But you actually answered it, and you said Where the Light Fell was your favorite book. Well, why is that?
It was the book that helped me put my own life together. I waited a long time. I've been writing about 54 years, pretty much full time. So, a lot of words, several million words over the years. But I had never tried to put my own story together in a thematic way. And it was like, Matthias, it was like one of these jigsaw puzzles, with 1,000 pieces. But there's no picture on the box. So I don't know what I'm going to come up with. And I start putting the pieces together. And then at the end, I think, aha, this is why I became interested in suffering. This is why I was first triggered into exploring grace. And this is what turned my conception of what Jesus was like around. And as I put the pieces together, I began to see that indeed there were these markers all the way through my life. Some of them dramatic and some of them very ordinary, and yet now I can look back and say, this is who I am, and this is why I became that person.
Almost like therapy, right?
Well, in a sense, I just didn't have anybody straightening me out. It was exploring.
Therapy, counseling yourself. That'll be a perfect transition to the fact that you're very upfront about your upbringing and how tough that is. You talk about it's a fundamentalist upbringing, very strict and rigid.
Right.
And the question obviously is you worked your way through this and you wrote a book about it, and that was your therapy. But do you have, would you say you had either PTSD through it, or is an appreciation of what it is? Because typically it's the hard things that make us grow and form us into who we are, right?
I came across a survey in a secular magazine one time, and it's surveying church people, and this person had a questionnaire. Filled this out to see, and it was called, I was a teenage fundamentalist. So I went through and filled out the survey. And at the end I looked at it and I said, there were a lot of things that at the time I didn't like. It was very strict. We weren't allowed to do certain things that everybody else in school could do. I felt a little oppressed. There was a lot of hellfire and judgment, and maybe there was a little PTSD. But what I took away primarily were good things. I got the knowledge of the Bible because it was preached regularly. We would go to church 3 or 4 times a week, every week. And I learned discipline. And I learned that the choices we make, the things we do in life ultimately matters. And those are incredibly important lessons to go through life. There were some things that I had to shed along the way. For instance, my church was very angry. It was very legalistic. It was racist back in the early 1960s. Those were bad things. I had to grow out of them. But the core things, I look back with more gratitude when I see my brother, for example, took a different route, and he just went as far away from religion as he could. And he didn't learn discipline, and he threw away what he knew about the Bible, and he ended up on a fairly self-destructive past, whereas I came through trying to keep the good things, but letting some of the other things slide off.
Both of my parents are gone, and in retrospect, you analyze or you go through the evaluation of how you grew up. I had a very protected upbringing, very Christian too, but very protected and not as traumatic as you describe. But in retrospect, you kind of evaluate your past a little bit different, and there are certain things that you just see different than in the situation yourself. So looking back at this, what is it that you would say you see different now than you saw when you were growing up? What are the things that you took away, that you learned from it?
The most important thing I learned was a misunderstanding of what God is like. I emerged from that kind of strict environment with the idea that God is this scowling policeman in the sky, just waiting to look for somebody to do something wrong. God, gotcha, gotcha, gotcha. And there certainly is an aspect in which God has these rules that he wants us to follow for our benefit, they're not arbitrary rules, they're for our sakes. But far more important than that is the underlying truth that God is a God of love. In fact, John, the Apostle John, says in one of his letters that God is love. Not God loves, but God is love. His essence is love. But the only way you can express love is to have something to love, something other than yourself. And God was contained. He didn't need to create. He didn't need to create people. But he did so out of love. He wanted creatures to share in just the joy of existence. And he gave his love, and then as people disappointed him grievously, he actually gave his son, that famous verse in the Bible, John 3:16, for God so loved the world that he gave his only son. And somehow I missed that. I believed that my faith was mostly about keeping the rules and satisfying I'm going to get zapped if I don't do something right, you know?
Mm.
And I miss that underlying sense of the prodigal son. The father runs out to meet him just every day looking, will today be the day that my son comes home? I love my son. I want my son back. And even when you think of a grievous person who disobeys, who turns away from God, God is still, like that father, on the edge of the porch looking, could today be the day when my son comes back?
But when you don't have something or someone to model this for you, what God is, how do you come to that realization? How do you redefine? Well, what was that process like for? How do you discover who God really was for you?
That is a challenge. It was a challenge for me. I had no father. My father died when I was 1 year old, so I have no memory of him whatsoever. And my mother was a sad person. She had staked everything on her relationship with her husband. She had 2 young boys, and then they were planning to be missionaries, Matthias, in Africa. And he got polio. There was a polio epidemic at the time. He was in an iron lung. And a group of Christians thought, surely God would not allow him to die. So they said, if we just pray hard enough, maybe he will be healed. And they became so convinced that he would be healed that they removed him from the iron lung, unplugged it as it was. And he didn't get healed, he died. And my mother, I'm sure she must have felt a sense of betrayal by God. You know, I was going to give my life for you, and look what you've done to me. And she took that out in some unfortunate ways. She expressed her anger to her sons because we were the ones who complicated her life. She didn't know how to write a check. She had never driven a car. She had to start life all over. And in an environment like that, it took me a long time to really understand the love of God. It was only later, as an adult, when God put me with some people who showed me, who demonstrated what love was like, that I began to realize what I had missed all those years.
I think it's a timeless phenomenon, a problem that people get hurt and they associate that with God. And it's so easy in a situation like this is to blame God and say, God, why did you let this happen? That's the typical question that people ask, that we ask in those situations. Did you ask that question?
I don't think my mother did ask that question. You don't question God. But actually, I think you can and do and should. Because I look at the Bible. I mean, in books like Psalms, about half of the Psalms are Psalms of lament, saying, God, I don't like the way this world is running. I don't like the way you're running this world. Job, one of the oldest books of the Bible, is the story of a good man who did nothing wrong, did nothing to deserve punishment, and yet it looked like he was being punished, and he thought he was being punished. When God appeared, he said, no, Job, that's not what was going on. It was a different kind of test. It was an important test going on between me and the forces of evil. And you, even though you felt I was against you, I've never been more for you, Job. And I see that all the way through the Bible. Suffering, God really never explained to Job why. He said, basically, you couldn't possibly understand, Job. I'm just asking you to trust me even when you've got no reason to trust me, and I'll make it worth your while. And I think that's an important lesson that we all go through at times because we all go through hard times.
You think that's the difference between you and your brother? At some point you make this decision, you know, I redefine who God is for me. I distance my definition of God from my personal experience, how it was lived to me. Or you say, no, that's what it is, and I give up on him. Is that kind of the crossroads that happened there?
Yes, it's hard to understand how and why people make choices, isn't it? You know, my brother was an older brother, so he would he was the pioneer. He would take things on, and he had a strong sense of justice, and he felt he was being treated unfairly, and we were being treated unfairly compared to people around us. But I saw the choices he made, and I saw that he was the one who was hurt by those choices. They were self-destructive. So he wanted to get away from the church. He became addicted to alcohol to drugs to sex to all these things, trying to get away from that fundamentalist background. And I looked at him, and he was a couple years older, and I thought, that's not a very healthy way to go. I don't want to end up there. I need to find another way. And then I was put in touch with some remarkable people as a writer who gave me a different path. Dr. Paul Brand was one. He was a great scientist and physician in India. He worked with leprosy patients. And we did 3 books together. And during that time, I followed Dr. Brand around, and I saw what a true person of God was like. And it wasn't a kind of a shrunken person who didn't have any fun. It was a person who was fully alive, who gave himself in service to others, and ended up, as Jesus said, it looks like you're losing your life, but you actually find your life when you give yourself away in that way. And I wanted to be like that kind of person, not like kind of the rebel that my brother had been.
Yeah, I assume in that process of redefinition, we're going to talk about deconstruction, reconstruction in a moment a bit too, but I think in this process of redefinition of your understanding of God, you look for anchor points for models, right? It can be people, but it can be the Bible. And what role did the Bible play in your redefinition, relearning, reacquainting with God process?
Yeah. Well, we're at the Museum of the Bible, so that's a great question, Matthias. I had an unusual experience. I was hired at one point to work on an edition of the Bible for younger people called the Student Bible, the Student Bible. And so I was paid for a 3-year period to go through the entire Bible, verse by verse, and look for things that we could highlight to try to explain some of the background or the context of what's going on for a newcomer to the Bible. But then I wrote a book called Disappointment with God. I went to Colorado, where I now live. I didn't at the time, I was in Chicago. And I took a whole suitcase full of books with me. And I was hoping to do some skiing in between writing a book, but it snowed so hard they had to close the ski slopes, and I couldn't get out my driveway. And I ended up being there for 2 weeks, and I only read one book, and that was the Bible. I read all the way through the entire Bible.
Oh.
I was trying to figure out, why is it that God sometimes seems very engaged, very interactive with human behavior? Like the 10 plagues of Egypt, these very strong, or the pillar of fire, the pillar of cloud, guiding the Israelites. Sometimes, as portrayed in the Old Testament especially, God was very involved, and then other times kind of hands off. So right before the 10 plagues of Egypt, right before he liberated the slaves from Egypt, it says, for 400 years there was no word from the Lord, no apparent miracles. And that happened before Jesus' birth too. For 400 years after the prophet Malachi, there was no word from the Lord. So why? What if you were in that 400-year period? You would wonder, where is God, And so I just decided to go through, and everywhere the word God appeared, try to figure out, why was he this way then and acted in a very different way another time? And finally I just said, I'm just going to read the entire Bible, and I saw the entire panorama of what God was up to. It's a love story. And this sounds like a strange phrase, Matthias, but I could see God, quote, learning how to be a parent. Learning how to be a parent. I know that sounds kind of heretical, but what I mean is God was trying to figure out, how do I love these ornery people that make me so mad sometimes I want to just wipe them out and start all over again. How can I do that? How can I? Because when I appear, there are body bags. Only one person was able to talk to God in the Sinai desert, and that was Moses. And the others would say, "I can't even look at you. You're glowing." God, how can God become close to human beings? And of course, we know the story. The story is that God became close by becoming a human being, by becoming one of us. Not just one of us, but one of us who who was vulnerable, one of us who could be hurt, who could be crucified. And that was the story. And it's a story of this huge God who created a universe that may have as many as 2 trillion galaxies. How do I relate to a person? And then finally, God became a human being, and then he didn't stay, he left, but he said, it's good for you that I'm leaving because I'm leaving my spirit behind. And God is an infinite God, and that spirit can live in each one connected to the vine, connected to the Father. And when I saw that grand sweep of the story of God becoming close, it just changed the way I viewed everything.
And that's God learning to be a parent. I'll have to chew on that a little bit. Yeah. You describe the Bible as the most honest book.
Yes.
You know. Can you explain what you mean by that?
Well, sure. I mean, you think who would be the great people of the Bible? Well, in the Old Testament, Moses certainly, David certainly in the New Testament, Peter, Paul. Okay, look at these people. Moses had an anger problem. He killed somebody and kind of covered up the murder, and then he got caught. David had murder and adultery. Peter wasn't all that different than Judas. He betrayed Jesus. 3 times he said, I never knew that guy, even though he'd followed him around for 3 years. Paul was making his living torturing Christians. And these are the giants. These are the big guys in the Bible. God can use anyone. He can transform anyone. Look at those people and look at us. Look at John Newton. We have so many examples in history of people who are running away from God, and then God would suddenly just tap them on the shoulder and say, I have a different plan for you. Follow me.
You say now that you write a lot about the Bible and what it teaches us, but you recently say that the books that you write and what you do is about yourself and the process, I mentioned it earlier, of deconstruction and reconstruction. I think it's a process that a lot of people share, regardless of faith, and in the evangelical space there's even the term evangelical, of people who just give up on the church and sometimes give up on God per se. Walk us through that process, how you moved from the deconstruction to the valley to reconstruct a new mature or just a renewed understanding of God.
Yes, often, for example, in an airplane or a doctor's waiting room, I'll have a casual conversation with a stranger I've never met. And I'll say, where do you live? What do you do? And those kind of introductory questions. And they'll say to me, what do you do? I said, well, I'm a Christian author and I write about questions of faith. And sometimes they don't want to talk about that at all. Other times they'll just kind of sit back and say, yeah, I used to be a little bit into that stuff. I went to a camp one summer when I was a teenager and went to church for a while, and then I don't do that anymore. So, oh, really? Why not? And then they'll usually tell me a story of being wounded, often being wounded by the church. Maybe the way my parents were treated when they got a divorce, or maybe the church, or maybe the way the church handled, say, my gay brother or something like that. They tell me a story of anger or being rejected. And I'll kind of lean back and say, oh, you know what? Actually, the church is a lot worse than that. Let me tell you my story. And they'll say, I thought you said you were a Christian author. I said, well, I am. But it would be a bad trade to forego, to lose a chance to connect with the God who created everything that is because of the way the church treated somebody 20 years ago. Don't you think? And they'll say, well, I've never thought about it like that. And I guess I feel that I was given this gift of a pretty toxic church, which I describe, and a pretty toxic family. And yet the redemption that comes out of it, the transformation that God can take even with that start in life. I try to be very honest. I've explored my own life. I've explored my own faith. we didn't, when I was young, we didn't use words like deconstruction and reconstruction, but in a sense, we all decide I'm not the same as my parents or my grandparents. There have been changes here, and I think this is important, but I think they miss this emphasis. I think I need to find my own way of putting together my faith, and that's healthy. I think I see that happening all the way through the Bible. You know, the prophets rail against God. They want an explanation. They demand answers. And when I'm with a person like that, I'll say, I have respect for a God who not only gives us the freedom to doubt and to argue, but actually gives us the words that we can use in a book like Ecclesiastes or Psalms or Job or Lamentations, some of the prophets. God has big shoulders. And you can shake your fist at God, and God can take it. He can handle it, and He can see you through those doubts. But don't do that unless you're willing to go all the way through. Let God first listen to you, get your emotions out, and look for an answer that you can live with the rest of your life.
I'm a journalist by trade. I love questions. And sometimes I feel, with have quite a few friends who are not Christians and who call God either non-existent or an idiot because he lets all these bad things happen in the world. How do you move from those questions that are valid and people want to understand? How do you move to kind of a new understanding? How did you get your answers? Well, how did you get over this hump? In your case, I think it was pain and an understanding of why things come together. What did move you across this hump from the slope down of D to reconstruction?
I could give you some philosophical answers, but I don't think it usually works that way.
Yeah.
In my case, as a journalist, I started out thinking, I want to be one of those investigative journalists. The Watergate scandal had just happened. Yeah. We had Carl Woodward and Carl Bernstein and Woodward. And I thought, man, wouldn't that be great to write about these scandalous people? And I did a few articles like that, but the problem with that is that you're hanging around jerks all the time, scandal type people, And so instead, I started looking for people that I wanted to learn from, that I wanted to be like. And I think it only takes one truly redeemed person to make you think, I'd like to be like that person. And for me, it was a man named Dr. Paul Brand, who was as brilliant a man as I've ever met. He was offered the head of surgery at Oxford University, at Stanford University. But he worked among the most abused people on the entire planet. There's nobody worse off than somebody of the untouchable or the Dalit caste in India who has leprosy. And he devoted his life to those people. And I followed him around, and we ended up writing 3 books together. So I spent almost 10 years with him. And I saw that Jesus was right, that if you indeed do live your life to please God, the rewards work out on their own. I mean, on one sense, you think, how miserable, hanging around people with leprosy all day. No, I've never met a more joyful person, a person who gave himself, but in the process of giving himself away, he found himself, which is what Jesus promised. Take that leap and serve me, and I'll make it worth your while, because you'll be the better person because of it. You're not giving yourself away, you're finding yourself in that very process. So I think it takes one person like that is all you need. That's what God had in mind. Now I get it.
You describe, I think, a spiritual process there, but I think that there's 2 more dimensions to it. There's kind of like an emotional sense, specifically when there's hurt and disappointment involved, and there's a rational side, and people approach the Bible in different directions. I remember reading about Paul Ricoeur pitching the term second naivete, where he said, I believe despite all the doubts that I have. At some point I come to the realization that I can't explain everything, but I believe despite of it.
A little bit like the man whose son was demon possessed, and he came to Jesus, and Jesus said, "Well, do you believe I can heal him?" And he said, "I believe. Help my unbelief."
Yes, yeah, to some extent, but it's a more mature version. It embraces the doubt, it embraces the question, it embraces the fact that I don't have answers for everything, and I don't need to. Right? Is that something that Brian taught you? Is that a component that was part of it, or do you feel like you have the key questions answered that you had before?
He helped answer them for me, because like I was concerned about why is there pain and suffering in the world? And he was the one who established the fact that all the images that we associate with the disease leprosy, people who are missing fingers and they're going blind and things like that, that all comes about because they don't feel pain. Pain is the warning system that keeps us from destroying ourselves. And all leprosy does, it destroys nerve cells. And then they actually destroy their own flesh by not having that protective value of pain warning them when they're doing something wrong. So they may reach into a fire and pick up, he's actually seen this, pick up a potato that's roasting on the fire. Meanwhile, they've singed their fingers, but they didn't feel it, so they didn't have that reaction of not doing that anymore.
Mm-hmm. Studies show that younger generations more than ever kind of fall away from the Bible, have their questions, fall away from the church, and partially by asking those questions, you going through that process yourself. Is there an advice? Is there an approach that you give? Try this, or to work through your questions, your doubts about the Bible and about God.
Well, you certainly aren't going to be wrestling with those questions if you say, I'm going to stay away from the church, I'm not going to read any Christian books. For me, because I am a reader, and because I grew up in a church where they yelled, books were my way of working through those questions. It was something that I could control. So people like C.S. Lewis, for example, hugely influencing me and my faith, because I could read it, and if I didn't understand it, I didn't have to keep going. I could just shut the book and maybe come back a little later, or ask some trusted friends about that. So we all have different paths, but I think being connected with a community of faith and finding what I call a doubt companion, somebody that you can be absolutely honest with and just say, I don't believe that stuff. Who doesn't say, oh no, get away from me, but says, well, what don't you believe? What's hard for you? Let's talk through that together. I guess the most important message is it's worth that struggle, and it's okay to struggle. There's plenty of that in the Bible. The Bible is a place for doubters, and it's a place that shows what we should be doubting. I find that a lot of people who think they've got it figured out, when they become parents, they realize how helpless they are. When you try to explain God to your 3-year-old, 4-year-old, and you realize how what's best for them, but they make these wrong choices. And you kind of understand what it's like for God. God knows what's best for us, but we make, like a 3-year-old, we make these wrong choices. And so sometimes I tell parents who are worried about their kids in college, you know what, just give them 10 years, okay? Wait till they're out in the world, starting a family, and their kids start asking questions, and they're going to see what's going on a little differently than they are as a college student.
There's a pattern in your work and your life to go to difficult spaces, to difficult places. Maybe it's the journalist, maybe it's your history, and going through those painful experiences. But you don't shy away from difficult topics like sexuality, homosexuality, Russia and Ukraine, the divided world. It's almost like you're asking for trouble sometimes. Do you see that as a ministry, something that you're called to do, to go to those places? Why you do that?
I would like to say yes, but the answer is no. I do that because I have those questions. I'm not sitting there thinking, let's see, what could I write about next that people are struggling with? No, it's, what am I struggling with? What don't I know the answer to? And the best way for me to explore is to write a book about it. there are some people who are experts in theology, who are seminarians, and they write because they're experts in a field. I write because I'm not feeling good about something. So my publisher came to me one time and said, I think you should write a book about prayer. And I said, prayer? I don't know anything about prayer. I feel bad about my whole prayer experience. And then I started thinking, then I should write a book about it. Because I can go to the people who can help me and spend the time, and that's my full-time job, to take a question like that and just explore it as a journalist. Journalists are different than the experts. We're not talking down to people. We're holding their hand and saying, let's go together and explore this. And then later I turn around and other people say, thank you for leading the way. I said, well, I wasn't leading the way. I was just trying to figure it out for myself.
Why do you think society as a whole, and maybe even Christians specifically, have such a hard time having a healthy debate about topics like that, to kind of stay united while disagreeing about specific topic? I know how difficult that question is, but do you have a way of cracking that nut?
I don't think that's ever going to change. Early on, I mean, just read the New Testament. Read the book of Ephesians, then read the book of 1 Corinthians, then read the book of Galatians. And, you know, one church is going off on this direction, the other church is going off on this direction, and they're not getting along. And I mean, that happened within a few years of Jesus leaving the earth. He turned it over to us. And sometimes I use this phrase that God uses the talent pool available. You know, he doesn't send down these super saints. He uses people who are willing to follow Jesus. And they're not always the smartest. They're not always the most emotionally balanced. You know, they're wounded people. They're broken people. But they're people who want to learn. And best they can, they want to follow Jesus. So I think we're always going to disagree. I wish we were more civil. I wish we were better listeners to each other. But you look at the history of all the denominations in the world, and instead of finding a way to get along with people who see things differently, we usually break off and start our own denominations.
So how do we break this? How do we break this? How do you do that?
Well, you keep preaching and saying, Jesus said, if you go back to Jesus' last time with the disciples, which we see in John 13-17, he says, first, I want you to be known by your love for one another. And I want you to have the kind of unity that we have in the Godhead, Father, Son, and Holy Spirit. That's what I want. So that when people look at the church, they say, people in the rest of the world just can't get along, but the church people, they know how to get along. I haven't seen that happening very often, but that's what Jesus told us to keep working on.
That formulates one of my big prayers. We spoke about pattern to close out the conversation. Patterns in your life, and one of them obviously is, you know, your way of dealing with pain and with unexpected kind of hurdles that you have to overcome, obstacles that you have to come. You openly speak about your Parkinson's diagnosis, and you called it a gift I didn't want.
Right.
What are you learning about yourself in this phase?
Yeah. My wife came across this definition of health that has helped me. And it goes like this. Health is the ability to adapt to life as it happens. The ability to adapt to life as it happens. We tend to think of health, oh, that's when everything's going well. Well, in this world, not everything is going to go well. We're all going to face some challenges. Sometimes it's very personal, like the two physical ailments that I'm struggling with now. Sometimes it's like having a child who has some sort of birth defect or some disability, or just the pain of trying to make a living, trying to find your way. Life is full of difficulty, and health is the ability to, I would add, to trust God with the ability to help us adapt to life as it happens. And there are certain things we can't control. I can't control whether I get this disease or not. And that's not my job. my job is to respond with gratitude, I would say, and with a sense of vulnerability and honesty, and be willing to ask for help from the body of Christ. That's why we're here, in helping me through that. It's not an easy thing to face possibilities in my future, but I don't spend any time worrying about it, because that's not going to do any good. I'm trying to use the time that I have left. I have this day, this moment, that's really all we can count on. And if I concentrate on that and trust God with the rest, then my blood pressure goes down, I have less anxiety, and I can enjoy what's right in front of me.
Yeah. I'm grateful that you shared this moment with me, with us. You said the Bible is the most honest book.
Good to be here.
Yeah, and I can give you the feedback. You seem to be honest about the world, the topics that bother you, your problems, and yeah, how to fight through this. And I find this very inspiring, and I hope our listeners and viewers see it the same way. So thank you for joining us.
Well, thank you, Matthias. I do believe it's the most honest book and also the wisest book. So I'm grateful for the people who put together this incredible building with rotating displays and exhibits about the history of the Bible and the effect that it spreads throughout cultures in all of history. There's no book that's had a greater impact on civilization than the Bible.
Thank you. Thank you so much for tuning in. If you liked this conversation, if you learned something new, then share it with your family and friends, or leave us a review so more people can find out about the history, narrative, and impact of the Bible. Be sure to follow us here or on your social media platform of choice. See or hear you next time on Unscrolled.